Hello everyone and welcome back for my episode 5 review titled In Space, No One. Yep, that's it, they cut it right there, but we are all familiar with the tagline. Right, where to begin with this one? There are numerous details to cover and nuances that make this episode distinct, albeit with some returning problems, but the return to space lends it a more alien feel. There are also some key details said in the show that directly relate to alien lore, and possibly where they found the xenomorph eggs, which I'll talk about later in the video. In fact, I'll add chapters just in case you want to jump right to it. It might be better if I quickly summarise my experience overall and then we'll explore parts in more detail. I knew the Maginot backstory was coming, but I didn't expect a whole hour dedicated to its demise. As someone who has critiqued many aspects of the show thus far, I must say that overall, I had a really good time with the crew on board this sinking vessel, and watching them all scramble around in a desperate attempt to solve the imminent crisis was mostly enjoyable. It begins with Morrow being abruptly woken from cryosleep to the news of a fire that has destroyed the ship's navigation panel and an outbreak in containment, one that, unbeknownst to the crew, contains the galaxy's deadliest organism. Oh boy, here we go again. The opening scene doesn't waste any time in taking us right back to those iconic images, and without any doubt we understand the severity of this predicament, even if the moderately disturbed crew, who are not taking this as seriously as they probably should, do not. The pacing throughout this prequel episode, which leads up to the show's beginning, is fairly consistent. It provides context, depth, and backstory to the crew and events that are now threatening to impact life on Earth. The set design, lighting, and level of detail were flawless, especially for those who appreciate and have a keen eye for the retro aesthetics that gave Alien its character in the first place. The horror and suspense elements were there on some level in what I felt was a reimagining of 1979's Alien. The increase of unease and trepidation during most of the hour was certainly present in ways the show hasn't achieved until now. It of course was nowhere near as vivid as the tension I experienced during the medlab scene in Aliens, or the feeling of utter helplessness and anxiety as Brett wanders into an encounter with only one ending. But it had integrity for the first 50 minutes, and there was much to appreciate. Some of the character interactions, particularly from a few worthy performances, played straight, natural and unpolished, brought me some of the essence that made the original film so grounded and real. I felt that Morrow dominated every scene with his mysterious intensity, and the little backstory involving the death of his daughter demonstrated the human side of this cyborg with finesse. The chief engineer, Shmuel, anchored the story in reality with his weathered demeanour and fixation on real-world workplace concerns, employing that good old-fashioned working-class common sense. Put them both in the airlock and have done with it, I believe he says regarding the still living but contaminated individuals. It's a nice idea, but it won't earn you any company shares, my friend. I wish we had a little more time with Mr. Teng, as I found his unsettling mannerisms and sarcastic quips to the rest of the group quite refreshing, and the guy makes me laugh. His dialogue with Morrow during interrogation was a strangely soothing counter to the determined nature of Morrow's intense questioning, leaving me with a strong desire to learn more about this individual that I first thought was an android, albeit with some shameless perversions. There were also some characters that, in my opinion, felt out of place or unnecessary in this foreboding escalation of terror. For instance, why hire an engineer for a crucial 65-year mission to collect priceless specimens whose IQ may be a concern for his crewmates? He had trouble differentiating between biology and geology in one ridiculous exchange of dialogue, and he didn't know what the term apprenticeship meant in another. He also thought a saboteur was a Frenchman. His foolish antics in a mess hall while the captain was talking to the crew became irritating and somewhat pulled me out of the growing tension. As for Rahim, the slightly rude, somewhat careless and shifty ex-junkie, who also miraculously ended up working for Weyland-Yutani as a medical officer, again just doesn't fit. His jittery and impulsive mannerisms detract from the professionalism I would expect from such a voyage, and sadly not in a gritty truck-us in space vibe either, thereby undermining the believability of the scenes in which he was present. But hey, the episode barrels forward with enough quirky thrills, suspenseful, lavish, and decent enough storytelling that I was so preoccupied with excitement over finally having something strongly akin to the alien experience that I really wasn't prepared for yet another slap in the face and further domestication and dilution of the xenomorph for the second time in the show. And as I said, this happens about 50 minutes in and was a bit of an anticlimax, to say the least. We all knew how fast the larva would grow off camera, and the stalking POV was undoubtedly the beast in question, as it hunts and analyses its prey. These sequences had the same creepy vibe as in the second episode, when it followed the soldiers out of sight, and the Xeno's entrance was beginning to look promising, especially within the methodical context of the rest of the episode. The problem is that when it does appear before Executive Officer Zaveri in all of its glory, although the creature looks better here within the ship's lighting, and I will say the practical tail effects are impressive, things suddenly shift from eager anticipation to an uncomfortable campy B-movie monster treatment. It has every advantage in this shot, biologically and positional, but instead of a sure kill, however, what happens next is some powerful plot armor for Zaveri, and sadly the creature becomes predictable, which is the opposite of fear, sadly, for which Zaveri demonstrates none of, by the way. So with a flick of its tail, she falls, only to bounce back up and outrun this athletically advanced creature through several corridors in what I can only describe as a shallow throwback to the extremely high-octane, adrenaline-filled and heart-pounding chase scenes in Alien 3. And say what you will about that film, and I'm all about the hashtag justice for Newt and Hicks, trust me. Fincher's vision of Alien managed to sustain a dense, oppressive atmosphere shaped by its claustrophobic environments and the pervasive sense of doom surrounding the characters. Even if you hated the story, you gotta respect its style. What really vexed me here was the ridiculous use of that good old horror chase illusion. It's an old technique to create the impression that the threat is much closer than it actually is, sometimes referred to as time dilation in editing. Nowadays, especially in the context of a story that is trying to be serious, it's more of a gimmick. The fact of the matter is, it would have gotten to her in a few seconds, judging by its speed, agility and the way it darted from wall to wall. Yet, during her sluggish sprint, she had time to traverse multiple corridors and even hide from the creature before she was able to leisurely descend the ladder and seal herself in a room. But the silliness isn't over yet, with the addition of a game of neck-biting after a slow-motion superhero jump, which made the Xeno cry out in pain, by the way, and then watching it trying to remove the eye octopus from its head that doesn't even have eye sockets without using its hands felt more like a parody. However, I'm pleased to say that this circus was confined to just 6 minutes of the whole episode. And I'm sorry for the negativity, guys, but I cannot defend this sequence at all. It was pretty awful, if I'm honest. It's tricky to pinpoint what I find off-putting about the alien. I can see the love and care that has gone into this creation, and the craftsmanship involved in animating the creature's motion was impressive, particularly in the seamless transition from a slow crawl to a fast sprint, and in the way it would attach itself to the walls. I just feel it's the combination of the rubber suit and the strange, abstract hand and head movements it now does as it was trying to track Zaveri. With all that said and my rant finally over, what I am pleased about is how the episode ended. My god, I hope the show shifts focus to Weyland-Yutani from now on, as the end sequence was phenomenal. Miss Yutani's presence in the scene with Morrow was a welcome treat. The level of authority, respect and admiration was tangible as she entered the room. The music and visuals really added an uplifting healthy dollop of genre fusion, I must say. It is the OG company from Alien, but with a delightful mix of Eastern vibes and subtle Blade Runner undertones. It cleverly layers prestige onto the infamous corporation, one half of the merger we have not been privy to before on screen. The set design is inspiring and speaks to the power and dominance this woman and her company hold. The samurai stormtroopers were a very nice touch as well. I'm hoping we get to see them in action soon. Before I cover some of the bits I missed out, let's first talk about what the ending signifies. We've had enough introduction into the world of Prodigy, its staff and the mindset of its leader, although I'm very eager to see where Kirsch's story arc leads, as well as the inevitable collapse of alien containment within the Neverland labs. What I've always hoped for, and I said this from the very beginning, was to witness a corporate war, one that is fought with the sword as well as pen. Miss Yutani never openly admits to sending in the cavalry, although I highly suspect this will happen at Morrow's request. But her admission to Morrow's strategy on how to proceed in reclaiming company property is essentially a declaration of war. So, with Morrow now granted full access to Weyland-Yutani resources, this could get very interesting. Will he receive more cybernetic enhancements before he ventures into enemy territory, and will he be alone? Given the way all these moving pieces are coming together, I suspect they will attempt to breach the Neverland facility at a crucial time when an outbreak is imminent, thereby forcing a three-way conflict between corporate rivals and aliens. I can envision this event unfolding in the penultimate episode rather than a cliffhanger for Series 2, and I'm looking forward to any tactical engagements that may ensue. Plus, I'm also desperate to hear that smart gun sound effect just one more time, please. In terms of the sabotage that takes place on the Maginot, well, we find out it was Boy K's doing when his delightful face pops up on screen to ask that the ship find its way onto Prodigy territory, with a false promise to a desperate engineer that he may live forever in a synthetic body if he carries out this request, which we know is not possible for an adult, yet that is. The countdown to impact begins. The engineer didn't take much persuading, but who knows what being out in space for 65 years does to you. I can also sympathise with the harsh reality of coming back home to no one. Upon discovering his betrayal and considering his later chat with Yutani, Morrow's ruthlessness and intimidating presence make much more sense now. And I will say much of the investigation and back and forth between the crew was enjoyable. We got to see a lot of the ship's interior and analog controls, some of which were almost identical to the original set. In fact, as Morrow reviewed the CCTV footage of the facehuggers following their instincts, it was very much like my experience watching the majority of this episode, constantly pausing to take a closer look at all the lavish details because everything we saw was so well crafted and had clearly been studied thoroughly. Seeing the investigation unfold also created some much needed dramatic tension among the crew as the ship fast approaches Earth with very little the engineers can do to stop it, made even more difficult by the escape of multiple species. I was a bit put out that we never got to see the planet scenes where the creatures were captured, but I understand that budget and time are more significant factors on a TV show. The lab scene was interesting enough, although it was a little careless on the part of the two crew members involved. We see the scientist and captor of these unknown organisms being secretly observed and then outmaneuvered by the very subjects she is analysing. The more screen time we have with Tio Celis, the more we learn how underestimating this lifeform's intelligence is a critical mistake. What I didn't expect was a similar display of intellect from the vampiric parasitic organisms, as they have clearly taken note of the opening mechanisms during their feeding patterns. It was also believable that its instincts would compel the creature to bolster its numbers and reproduce, rather than instantly going for the kill, a trademark of this franchise that should always be prominent. I mentioned the word careless twice now when describing some of the personnel, and in this particular scene I don't know what grossed me out more, the thought of these critters loose or the fact that she can sit there quite happily eating a sandwich among all the blood and excrement. All the while, the all-seeing horror sees all and learns what it needs. However, it receives a get-out-of-jail-free card when one of the episode's more irritating characters, the medical officer who I'm just going to call Dr. Nick from now on, blunders into the lab cursing away, probably a byproduct of his junkie days, forcing Shibuzo to not finish sealing the container. A big mistake. But also, I wonder how it never got glass in its eye during its escape. It must have one hell of a protective membrane. As the numerous spawn of the leech creature from the water flask made their way into Malachite, I was reminded of the tragic fact that there are not many surprises in Alien anymore. I hadn't predicted that the young could release a deadly gas when threatened, but I did get a sense of I know what's going to happen next, and I think we all did. We haven't seen the rest of the organisms yet, and aside from the man-eating plant, I'd imagine that there will be a common theme of humans becoming hosts for a horrific life cycle process. What doesn't help the use of this recycled formula is that nobody ever seems to be truly petrified, or even remotely upset over the death of their crewmates and the danger the survivors are in. I've remained interested in the show and this episode because I'm curious to see what happens, but the problems I've mentioned in this video may prevent me from giving the series a second viewing. Whereas I can hit play on Alien or Aliens and I'm instantly engaged by the setting, the story, and how the characters react to events unfolding around them. Here, it sometimes feels like the characters were written independently of the show, and then bundled together and thrown in. A couple of characters at various points said a few things that relate to the lore and are worth mentioning. After the crew decided to place the remaining individual who had encountered a facehugger in cryo to be frozen, Morrow, Zaveri and Dr. Nick argued over how the chestburster could have still formed and escaped. Dr. Nick suggested that due to their metabolism and the fact that it is known to the crew, and this is important, that they can survive in the cold vacuum of space. This is why it didn't freeze. It's fascinating because we have been treated to many additional traits of this species over the decades, which have bolstered the claim that this is the perfect organism. Alien Romulus revealed that the organism can perform cryptobiosis and cocoon itself, thereby surviving long periods in space. The burning question, therefore, is how the crew of the Maginot knows this specific detail, and perhaps more importantly, where did they discover the eggs? My theory is that 2 years prior to the Nostromo's visit, this crew did in fact land on LV-426 in the Zeta II Reticuli system 39 light-years from Earth. The moon in question, named Akron, barely had an atmosphere, and if a facehugger had been observed on its surface perhaps as they were transporting eggs from the derelict, then it could have been assumed or later tested that the specimens had the ability to survive the harsh environment of space itself. This possibility would also bridge some connective tissue between the stories, and also might help apply adequate reasoning for Ash at the last minute being added to the ship's roster, as well as Mother's calculated detour while the crew were in hypersleep. It's pure speculation to assume that the company had any knowledge of the derelict and its contents long before Ripley's fateful voyage. But considering Alien Earth is now lore and takes place only 2 years before, it makes sense to me that Weyland-Yutani would quickly send more fodder to the same location, with the aim of returning their prize specimen undetected through quarantine. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, please. The second interesting thing that was said in another scene was when Zaveri announced that the creature was a xenomorph. Firstly, the term itself has Greek roots, with xeno meaning strange, foreign or alien, and morph meaning form or shape. The organism was never described as such in 1979's Alien, as it remained a nameless and mysterious horror. It was only adopted by fans after 1986's Aliens, when Lieutenant Gorman says a xenomorph may be involved. Within the franchise, the term is likely used to describe an unidentified alien lifeform, as was the case with the Colonial Marines description. The species has since been given more official names such as Xenomorph XX121 or Internivus rapus if you prefer the Latin-derived scientific names. Maybe some of you call it a dragon, and why not? In any case, it struck me when the term was said that you just don't hear it enough within the films. Overall, it was a feast for the eyes and probably had more intricate details of the retro-aesthetic domain than Romulus did. The emerging Xeno proved to be a disappointment again. However, despite the unusual choice of character personalities and behaviours, I found myself becoming immersed in the murder mystery aspect and the time-sensitive quest to secure the ship. This, yet again, was mostly carried by Babu's performance as Morrow. The ending, on the other hand, was the delicious icing on the top of a less than appetising gluten-free store-bought cake. It really got me pumped for later installments, which will hopefully delve into Yutani's story. Who else is feeling the anticipation for that? As always, a big thank you to my subscribers for always tuning in, and I'll see you next week. Signing off.